Hello third year historians, and welcome to our next lesson in the National 5 topic on the slave trade. This lesson is one of the first that we are going to look at how the slave trade affected those areas of the triangular trade. So we're looking at Africa in this lesson, and then we'll look at how it impacted on the West Indies and the Caribbean islands, as well as how it impacted back in Britain. So for this lesson, the learning intention is basically to explain the impact of the slave trade on African societies. So we're going to be looking at both the positive things the slave trade brought as well as the negatives to Africa, and we're also going to be finishing off the lesson with a National 5 assessment skill. So just a bit of a recap. In general, we know that slavery had always existed. It existed in Africa thanks to places like the ancient Egyptians and the Romans and things like that, bringing in slavery as a normal sort of way of life. And most African societies used slavery as a punishment for serious crimes or for prisoners of war. These people were quite often made into slaves. However, by the 16th century, the conditions for these slaves were not the way we would expect them to be in the plantations during the slave trade era. They were basically the same as just general servants. They didn't do any more work than anybody else did in the places they were being held captive. Their food, their lodging and their clothing was exactly the same as everybody else in the tribe or the village or the area they were in. Basically, the only difference between them and the people who lived there was that they were kind of looked down on a little bit more because they were seen as slaves. But they more or less were just really servants who were not allowed to leave or didn't get paid for what they were doing. During the actual transatlantic slave trade itself, it's estimated that there were about 12 million Africans forcibly being taken to the West Indies from Africa as a result of these slave ships. Along with those who died during the journey to the coast, this actually comes up to roughly about 13 to 14 million Africans, and like we said in the last lesson, this journey to the factories on the coast could actually take weeks or sometimes months to actually get to, and quite often resulted in a lot of death along the journey as well. Now, generally speaking, the long-term implications of the slave trade for African societies affected many millions more on top of these people who were obviously taken and the ones who died either on the journey to the coast to the factories, in the factories themselves, or on the Middle Passage. But we're thinking about why these implications actually happened and what they really were moving forward. So ultimately, really, what happened at the time? So as the Europeans were able to actually trade slaves with the different kingdoms, because this was a normal thing for them to do, and the different tribes in Africa were quite keen to actually make this trade, they began to rely on there being warfare in order to actually get the number of supplied bodies that they needed to make the trades with the Europeans. Many kingdoms took enemies as slaves and prisoners of war, as we said, so they would trade them with the Europeans for weapons and gunpowder to make themselves more powerful. This then meant that they could invade other land that belonged to other tribes, take that land for themselves, which would be a benefit for them, and actually get more people to then trade as slaves. So this made more wars occur in Africa. It became a really serious area of war zones and fighting. Obviously, a lot of the different tribes were being supplied by weapons by the slave traders, which made the situation worse, and it became really that was the main focus of tribal life in Africa, was fighting against other enemy tribes. Ultimately, it leads to a decline in African population, especially a decline in the male population, because those are the ones that they really wanted to take away. As a result, there was a shift as women then had to start to fill the traditional role men did in African societies, and the population of Africa did not grow in the natural way it would have had slavery not existed. So we start to see a really serious impact on the population of the African societies, as well as problems with warfare becoming the main kind of source of getting slaves. The main impact then is this population changes. Now, we can still see the effects of these population changes on Africa today. It's one of the reasons that Africa is still a developing country in some respects. It is one of the reasons why it's maybe taking them that little bit longer to do the same things that Britain would be doing at the time, like the Industrial Revolution and things like that. There was a loss of men between the ages of 18 and 40 because this was the real kind of key ages for young slaves to be taken, because that was the best kind of labour ages, and especially the male ones. The introduction of guns and gunpowder was very negative to African societies, and there was a halt on industrial progress as well. This led to increases of wars between the kingdoms, and things didn't really develop in Africa the way they should have done had there not been intervention by the Europeans and the slave traders. So really we can break this down into these kind of 5 main areas. The mass importance of guns for slaves altered the conduct of warfare in Africa and changed the balance of power between the kingdoms. This created hatred and violence that remained long after the slave trade had ended. It's estimated that the population of Africa would be double today if there had been no Atlantic slave trade. So for example, Africa's population would have been 50 million instead of 25 million in 1850. The reduction in population resulted in a halt in the industrial progress in Africa and falls in the production of food and other goods, which led to poverty and starvation in certain areas. It developed a slave economy for many of the nations within Africa. So for example, 75% of all Africa's exports in the 18th century were enslaved humans. Cheap European imports destroyed any chance of Africans developing their own economy that wasn't focused on slavery, which meant that they had to rely on that in order to survive as a nation. It also leads to a lot of propaganda of these kind of racist ideas, which made Africans out to be inferior, and this is kind of where we start to see this kind of black versus white kind of racism starting to develop. It hadn't existed up until this point, and after this it really obviously very much does, and this has a direct influence on some of the other topics we've looked at, like the civil rights movement, as well as looking at kind of other situations even up to today with the whole Black Lives Matter campaign and things like that. This is where these racist attitudes start to develop for the first time. So this is kind of like the key 5 areas of the impact of the slave trade, and you might want to take a note just from these kind of key areas, so you've got a wee bit of information on this. So we might say, for example, the mass importation of guns for slaves altered the conduct of warfare in Africa. This created hatred and violence. The population of Africa would be double today if there had been no Atlantic slave trade. The reduction in population resulted in a halt in the industrial progress in Africa and falls in the production of food and other goods. It developed a slave economy for many nations within Africa, and cheap European imports destroyed any chance of Africans developing their economy. And propaganda of racist ideas have made Africans out to be inferior for centuries. So pause the video, take a note of the highlighted bullet points, and then move the video on to the next section. So just really quickly, a case study which is always really good to give as an example is that of the Ashanti Kingdom, which we have made reference to in the past couple of lessons. We're going to look at them just in a wee bit more detail. So the Ashanti Kingdom was located in modern day Ghana, which you can see here on this map. This is where it would be in modern day in Africa. They were established in the late 1600s. The Portuguese were most active in slavery at this region, but other European nations had used it too, and the Ashanti Kingdom became a very powerful trading partner with these Portuguese and other European nations, providing slaves for the slave ships. By 1800, the Ashanti Kingdom was a major exporter of people as a product, so their main source of export was people, and they were getting all of these goods coming in from the Portuguese and European slavers who were coming to them for these slaves. Roughly from about 1790 until 1896, the Ashanti Kingdom was in a constant state of war in order to get these people to supply the traders with. This was due to their efforts to expand land or defend land from other people. Consequently, they had a steady supply of captured people to sell as slaves, and eventually the kingdom was weakened and it could not defend itself when the British began to conquest for Africa, and they ultimately lost their land to the British. So what you're going to do just now is you're going to use the worksheet, which looks something like this, and it has a lot of information on the positive and the negative aspects of the slave trade. You're going to draw a table in your jotter, or you could choose to do it as 2 mind maps or just 2 headings. That's absolutely fine. I would maybe take a double page and do positives on one page and negatives on the other. And what you're going to do is you're going to read through each of the comments that are on one side of the worksheet, and you're going to decide if they are positive impacts or if they are negative impacts, and you're just going to summarise each point in your own words into your table. So you might want to pause the video and complete this task, and then come back to the video when you're done. Okay, so your last task then, now that you've got your table of the positive and the negative aspects of the slave trade, is to complete this National 5 assessment question, which is a mini essay practice question, and the question is, to what extent did tribal conflict, encouraged by the slave trade, cause the most harm to African societies? So what this question is really asking is, out of all of the things that caused harm, okay, that we've looked at, so the declining population, all of these other impacts, is it tribal conflict, this main kind of one that we're very badly trying to highlight here, the thing that caused the most harm to the African societies? Did it have the most negative impact? So just a wee reminder about how we do the mini essay practice. When we're doing mini essays, we use the mnemonic IFACE to help us plan our answer out. And we do each of these sections one by one to make sure that we've done everything we need to get our marks for this question. So we do a quick introduction to the essay. It could be giving a background fact, or it could be stating the factors that you're going to discuss in the essay. So for example, you could say slavery had always existed in Africa, however, as time goes on and the Atlantic slave trade becomes involved, it starts to become very negative. Or you can say, this mini essay is going to look at these things, and you can do it that way. Once you've done your introduction, you move on to talk about the named factor in your question, and you start to explain why it's important. So whatever your named factor in the question might be, in this case it's tribal conflict, is what you start with. And you start off your sentence by saying something like, some historians think that, and then whatever your sentence is. So it might be tribal conflict. So some historians think that tribal conflict caused the most harm to African societies. Then you give 2 or 3 facts about tribal conflict. Whatever they are, it's up to you, 2 or 3 sentences, and you can explain why this actually caused harm in each one as well to make your marks even better. What you then do is you start to discuss alternative factors when you're done. And you start this by saying, however, other historians think that the population decrease caused the most harm to African societies, and you give 2 or 3 facts about population decrease. You then give another one, so you might decide to say it was something like the lack of industrial growth. So you could say other historians think the lack of industrial growth caused the most harm to African societies, and then you give 2 or 3 sentences about that, just facts that you're talking about. That builds up your paragraphs, and then you start your conclusion. Clearly answer the question, what do you think is the main factor, what is the main reason, and you just say that really clearly. In conclusion, tribal harm did cause the most harm to African societies, or tribal conflict did cause the most harm to African societies, and then you put a full stop. This leads you on to your E, which is for evidence. You need to give one piece of evidence to support your conclusion really easily by saying, the reason I think this is because, or this is because, and then give one sentence that explains why you've decided that this is the main thing in your conclusion. At National 5 level, At National 5 level, these questions are worth 9 marks, and this is what you get marks for. So you get 1 mark for your introduction, whatever you decide to do. You can get up to 5 marks for your facts in your paragraphs. You get 1 mark for organising and discussing more than one factor. So you've done your named factor, and as soon as you say other historians think another factor was more important and you give a fact about it, you get another mark because you've introduced another argument. You get 1 mark for your conclusion with a clear answer. So in conclusion, I think tribal harm did cause the most harm, or tribal conflict did cause the most harm. And then you get 1 mark for saying why you think that. I think this because, and then as long as that answer makes sense, that gets you your last mark to make up your 9. So to help you out with this, I have given you an introduction, which you can just copy. So you can pause the video and copy this introduction. And you would say something like, the slave trade was the period when Africans were forcibly transported to the West Indies. This caused harm to the country, with some historians arguing that tribal conflict. So if we just kind of highlight, these are going to be what our paragraphs are going to be about. So tribal conflicts, our very first paragraph, caused the most harm. Others saying that the destruction of society caused the most harm, so that's going to be my second paragraph that I'm going to talk about. And others thinking it was the slave factories, which obviously we talked about in the last lesson, which is going to be my third paragraph that I'm talking about in this mini essay. So these are the 3 areas that I'm actually going to talk about in my mini essay: tribal conflict, destruction of society, and slave factories. So pause the video, copy your introduction, and then move on to the next slide to help you start your main body. So this is going to be our named factor. We're going to start it with the sentence in blue. Okay, so some historians argue that tribal conflict caused the most harm to Africa because. So I want you to write that sentence out, and then what you're going to do is you're going to pick 3 of these 5 points, and you're going to just write them into your sentences with maybe a little bit more detail. So what you could do is you could say, some historians argue that tribal conflict caused the most harm to Africa because, and then take bullet point number 1. Africans became slaves by being captured as prisoners of war, which encouraged fighting between tribes and caused a lot of warfare. Full stop. Then you're maybe going to say, African chiefs captured the slaves from rival kingdoms to trade for goods, which caused rivalry and revenge to become a normal part of African life. This was obviously a negative impact. And then we pick a last one, so I might say, the demand for slaves led to an increased hatred and violence between the tribes, which caused a lot of harm to African society. And I finish my sentence there. Once I've done my main body, I move on to my next paragraph. So you maybe want to pause the video here, write out your main paragraph, and then move the video on to look at your next one. So for your alternative then, you're going to introduce this using this sentence here. So you just copy this sentence and we do the same thing again. However, other historians argue that actually the destruction of African society caused the most harm because, and then the same thing. We're going to give 2 or 3 out of these ones that we're putting up here to choose from. So choose which ones you want to actually put in, write them in, and once you've done that, move on to the next slide to do your next paragraph. This is our last alternative then. So again, we start off with this sentence and we say something like, however, other historians argue that the slave factories caused the most harm because, and we just give 2 sentences or 3 sentences if we want to from the ones that we have here to pick from. That finishes your paragraphs off, and you need to then move on to your conclusion. So pause the video here to help you finish that sentence or that paragraph, and then move on to your conclusion. So we start this really easily. In conclusion, you pick out of the 3 that you've talked about which one you think caused the most harm and fill in the blank. So in conclusion, you might decide the slave factories caused the most harm to African societies, full stop. You then do your next sentence, which is your evidence, and you might say, the reason I think this is because it caused the most death and destruction, and it is where they started to be treated more inhumanely, which then became a regular part of African society. It's entirely up to you what your reason for this is. You don't have to repeat a fact you've already given. It can just be your opinion, and that's you finished your mini essay. So this week for your assignment, you are to finish your mini essay and upload your completed mini essay either as a photo from your jotter, if you are working on paper, putting it together and leaving it on your teacher's desk, or in a Word document that you upload to the assignment tab. And if you're stuck or you need any help, go back to this slide and take it one step at a time, or feel free to ask in your team, email your teacher and let us know how you're getting on.